The following is a podcast where expert practitioners and thought leaders share their insights and advice. A big thank you to all of you out there, our listeners. If you have any feedback or if you have a topic you'd like to hear about on this podcast, drop me an email at insights@securitycompass.com.
The difference between a failed and successful AppSec training session can be down in the details. So if a trainer just shares what SCA is and what are its benefits and why we should do it, and then move on to SAST and DAST and the same thing, what are the benefits, why we should do it, and then move on to secrets management and so on, that in my experience is not a very effective training session. No, what developers like to see is what people, process, and tools exist in your internal environments to perform these activities that empower developers in effectively and efficiently conducting these exercises without it being an impediment to the software development process.
You're listening to the Balancing Act podcast from Security Compass, your guide to going fast while staying safe in today's digital world. Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's podcast of the Balancing Act from Security Compass. I'm your host, Altaz Valani. Training developers on security is an important issue today. Many developers are eager to learn about security, but they need help. Developers move very fast because their performance is often measured around release frequency. All of this is happening while developers have to keep up with continually evolving frameworks and tools. So how can security teams influence developers to focus on security issues without getting in their way? Joining me today to discuss this topic is Pranshu Bajpai. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Altaz, thank you for having me on.
So for our listeners who may not know you, can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your history and how you ended up where you are today?
Sure. So I'm a principal security architect at Motorola Solutions currently. So in my role, I wear multiple hats. For instance, I engage with development teams to ensure our products and software are secure by design. I conduct deep evaluations of new security technologies to advise business on what security solutions to invest in. I also drive proof of concepts for new secure architectural problems that we may be looking to address. I also maintain documentation and technical guidance in certain cybersecurity standards, such as those in the realm of cryptography. Before joining Motorola Solutions, I completed my PhD in computer science at Michigan State, where the focus of my work was malware and threat research. While completing my PhD, I actually taught software programming for years. In fact, I not just taught programming to students, but also helped them debug their code. Sitting next to them during the help room sessions. So I consider myself lucky in that way, where I interfaced closely with hundreds, if not thousands, of young developers in their early learning years, which helps me now in my role as a security architect when working with development teams.
Wow, that's awesome. Very interesting background. So let's just jump right in and start to talk about developers and security. Perhaps, why don't we start at the very beginning? In your opinion, what challenges do developers face today with application security?
So today, the technical stack or the technological stack in organizations is convoluted, and it becomes difficult for developers to keep track of potential security weaknesses throughout the software development and application delivery process, especially in the context of modern CI/CD pipelines. There's so much room there to make security mistakes. In my experience, want to do the right thing, but the overall issue is that devs often lack support from the people, process, and tools at times to help with the security risks. zeroing down on some of the more prominent challenges to provide you some examples. First of all, there's lack of automation in security testing. So SAST and DAST tools exist, however, they're not perfect, mainly since they suffer from false positives and false negatives, but also can be slow on large code bases. They often also require tuning and configuration details in order to get them to, perform correctly in your specific environment. Also, and pertaining to this, there's also a lack of appropriate training for conducting effective SAST and DAST testing. And then generally, roughly for every 100 developers, we know that there's one security person, meaning the ratio of devs to security folks is about 100 to 1. And this creates a challenge for devs where coordinating with security teams gets difficult when security teams suddenly arrive late in the development process and suggest mitigations, point out vulnerabilities, suggest mitigations that may not be applicable within the application constraints, or it's costly and too late or too time consuming to perform these changes. In terms of configuration errors, they can be subtle and difficult to detect. As I've said, the CI/CD pipelines and the associated workflows, there's a lot of room to make security mistakes there. There's, people configure, devs configure often, Jenkins servers with third-party plugins on there. With these servers, there's room to make configuration mistakes that can have serious security implementation, security consequences. And then there's also secrets in the pipelines that can be exposed. So there's a lot of details, a lot of implementation level details to be figured out. There's third-party libraries bringing in a lot of untested and potentially vulnerable code. It's also costly and time-consuming to fix security bugs later in the development pipeline, but then how do devs identify and resolve bugs early in the pipeline, and can automation help? And then there's a lack of visibility. So how many vulnerabilities exist in the application? How severe are they? So in terms of prioritization, and then is there a place I can go to as a developer where there's metrics for vulnerabilities that exist in my application? And often in terms of mitigation, detailed guidance is missing. So don't just tell me to sign my code, show me how to do it. By show me, I mean point to implementation details. And we've also seen that there's no good secure coding standards out there. We all talk about secure coding. However, we do not provide a good standard or good reference point to our developers in terms of the programming languages that they may be using as part of their daily job in order to help them write secure code.
Yeah, that's interesting. We talk here about security in the pipeline and then security over the pipeline, and all of these need to come together. And one way that we can achieve this is by looking at some kind of training. And like, again, security training is so broad. Perhaps we could just focus in on one aspect of this. In your experience and in your opinion, what are developers looking to address from application security training? So I'd really like to take like a developer-centric view on this. So let's look at it from their standpoint. What are they looking when it comes to security training?
So developers are naturally curious about the security vulnerabilities that exist in their code. At the end of the day, I think we all want to take pride in our work. In the case of development, this means knowing we wrote an efficient, functional, and secure application. But there's a caveat to this. Unless the security process is so convoluted and resource heavy that it becomes a burden, in which case, maybe security is somebody else's responsibility. Mm-hmm. And an AppSec training program that can enable developers in testing against, identifying and resolving security weaknesses that may exist in their code is highly popular among developers. So ideally, this training program will provide implementation level details and not just preach security commandments to developers. The difference between a failed and successful AppSec training session can be down in the details. So if a trainer just shares what SCA is and what are its benefits and why we should do it, and then move on to SAST and DAST and the same thing, what are the benefits, why we should do it, and then move on to secrets management and so on, that's in my experience is not a very effective training session. No, what developers like to see is what people, process, and tools exist in your internal environments to perform these activities that empower developers in effectively and efficiently conducting these exercises without it being an impediment to the software development process. Mm-hmm. So that means what is software composition analysis, but then also how do I do it within these within my company? What is SAST or static application security testing? What tools exist for this purpose? And then how do I manage false positives? How do I tune these SAST and DAST applications? How do I use them in my CI/CD workflow? Do you have a GitHub action workflow or something similar that I can plug into my CI/CD environment to perform scans as part of the build process? And then how do I use pre-commit hooks to scan for secrets that may have been accidentally pushed into my commit? And what tools do you recommend for secret scanning? Same for, we all make mistakes at times, and we, here or there, we will accidentally push secrets into a repository. Then in that case, how do I safely purge secrets that I might have pushed into a repo? What is an SBOM, and why does it matter for AppSec? And how do I generate an SBOM for the application that I'm working on? And how do I eventually, as part of the SBOM, when I see the vulnerabilities or the potentially vulnerable components, how do I manage and track vulnerabilities pertaining to my applications? So the details during the training, during the application security training session, can make all the difference for the developers.
Interesting. Now we often hear about security teams coming in, and you talked about this earlier as well, right? They come in and it's sometimes too late. And at that point, we're just getting ready to release something. And then suddenly we've got all these security issues that come in the way. Can you talk a little bit about how security teams can try to influence rather than trying to put these commandments or these mandates around application security practices? So really coming alongside developers and saying, look, we're on your side. Here's what can be done to make you a better developer. So really leading by influence in that sense. So what are some things that security teams can do to try to initiate this type of influence-based approach?
Absolutely. I feel very strongly that security personnel, as security people, it is incumbent upon us to obtain buy-in from the dev teams that we work with. Basically, we want to project our image as in support of the development process rather than coming in late into the development process and then issuing these commandments and these checks and guidelines and then being viewed as an impediment to the software delivery process. So people, especially developers, are at the forefront of all AppSec efforts. Ultimately, security folks that descend from the heavens to preach security to development teams in the form of thou shalt commandments are almost always largely ignored. Enforcement of security practices only goes so far. So there's two things that are crucial to be actually impactful when sharing guidance towards securing DevOps workflows. Number one is to listen and understand developer perspectives on why the current risks exist. So a lot of the times, like I've said, developers want to do the right thing, but they're resource constrained. They may not have enough time and enough knowledge at times about specific security concepts and scenarios. And even if they do have the knowledge, perhaps they're lacking tools and process to get to the resolution or to the mitigation. So try to listen and understand. If it's, as a security person, it is important to listen what the problem is and which constraints define that problem. And then we need to propose solutions while working with the development team within those constraints. And then number two, it's very important to enable developers in following the security guidance by sharing technical implementation examples as far as possible. That is not just tell them what to do, but actually show them how to do it. And this can be done in a number of ways. In your organization or in your company, you can be maintaining internal documentation on different security practices. For instance, if you're asking development teams to sign their code, depending on if they're signing iOS code or if they're signing Android APKs or if they're signing Windows DLLs, you can maintain detailed guidance on implementation level guidance on how to do it, what people, processes, and technology or tools exist within your organization to help with these. And then ultimately through this, we develop a scenario where we're not seen as people coming in and preaching, but we're seen as people coming in and helping and supporting the software development process rather than being an impediment. Also, it's very important to create a security champions program that ensures that development teams have at least one security-oriented person who can peer review all internal DevOps activities at the team level. Like I've said before, the ratio for security people to developers is about 100 to 1. So we can't have a security expert on every development team, but then we do have developers that are interested in security in most development teams. So then let's enable those developers, let's empower those developers in taking that security perspective and reviewing everything from a security perspective when these development activities are being conducted.
Yeah, it's a great point. Now, when we talk about security training, sometimes there's a perception that security training means setting up an LMS, having courses, having a curriculum, and that's a lot of effort to set something like that up, and you've got to track it. So let me ask you, is application security training really suitable only for larger companies with mature development teams?
Application security training is for everyone, even for small companies. If we're putting a product or software out there, then it is our utmost responsibility to ensure that that application is free of security vulnerabilities. Like I've said before, security, unfortunately, we have this concept of security being seen as an add-on to the software delivery process and not an integral part of it. But that's what we're looking to change now with the shift left mentality. Is security needs to be integrated deeply into the software development process, and therefore there is no way to look at security training from the perspective of whether I'm a big company or a small company. Ultimately, we are putting products and software out there, so and that needs to be free of security. So if you want to think about it in the context of maybe you're a small company today producing a product or software that's not deployed widely. You're not as big as some of the other software companies. However, that software can still exist in critical environments. For writing software for, just to give you a random example, for a 911 call center, or for evidence management in a police department. Now, those are the kind of places where the software will not be put out in the consumer market. Is probably not in every home out there, but it's still in critical places, and it's still important to ensure that that software is free of security vulnerabilities, and therefore, and a large part of that is tied back to, like I said before, people are the forefront of all of our AppSec efforts. And by people, I mean our developers. And therefore, training our developers in application security is important, not just for larger companies, but for smaller companies as well.
That's interesting. And now you start to talk about operationalizing application security, not just to offer some initial training, but to have this continual reinforcement. What do I need to do in my code? How do I test against it? And it kind of is this process that goes throughout the construction and delivery process when it comes to software. Can you talk a little bit about your experience and your insights around operationalizing this application security? You talked briefly about the people, the process, the tools. How do we operationalize this? How do we look at integrating this stuff? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so there are ways that we can make our AppSec training more effective for developers. One way is to ensure that we are considering common application security risks, threats, vulnerabilities that we observe in the wild, for instance, the OWASP top 10. But so that's the external source. But then internally, we need to also collect, analyze, and operationalize current application security metrics within our internal environments. So for instance, if our SaaS and DaaS tools are finding repetitive or similar security vulnerabilities among different or the same development teams, then perhaps the data is indicating that our development teams can benefit from AppSec training and learning sessions geared around these specific security risks. And if the risks are severe and repetitive, then we need to perhaps conduct deep dive sessions to ensure that we enable our developers in understanding why the security scanning tools are flagging these as high or critical, and what is the best way to mitigate these during development. So with these targeted and focused training sessions that are an add-on to the general training sessions that you may already be providing, with the targeted and focused training sessions, we can gear these around vulnerability metrics and other security insights, things we're seeing in our internal environments. And then we reduce the cost, since security issues are then resolved early in the development cycle, since you're training the developers to think from that perspective. And ultimately, that's how I think about operationalizing the application security to reinforce that learning and training cycle.
Yeah, and this touches on the ability to operationalize even at higher levels when you start to collect metrics and things that can now roll into decisions that need to be made at many different levels. So tell me something. When's the best time to train developers?
Early in the morning, ideally around 7 a.m. Developers love that. As early as possible, I would say. It is critical that security be integrated into the mindset of a budding developer as early as possible. So by delaying the security training, we're just exacerbating the issue that we've created in software development. And the issue that we've created is that in traditionally, so if you think about it, trace it all the way back to when a person first learns programming. So traditionally in schools and software boot camps, we've had programming lectures and assignments that focus heavily on functionality. Which is definitely important. After all, software applications exist to perform some functions. However, there's no emphasis on security during development. But we know that get the job done is different from get the job done safely, and that's different from get the job done efficiently. So these are all different components. And in interviews for software development positions, it's common to ask the applicants to write some code that demonstrates some functionality. Then we perform some unit tests to check that functionality. And then usually questions are asked about space-time complexity of the code to determine the efficiency of the code. But what about security? So security, unfortunately, becomes an afterthought. We're trying to change that. And, I'm happy to say that we are definitely trying to bring about that change, where we're trying to integrate security early into the thought process of a new developer. But later on in the developer's career, ultimately, what happens with this in this kind of scenario is they will eventually be asked to write secure code, perform input validation, asked to sign their code and the relevant artifacts in the CI/CD pipeline, use SCA, SAST, and DAST to manage vulnerabilities, perform secure secrets management. And all of this is new to the developer. and issues arise since no training has been provided and no training is being provided. So now the developer is left to discover security concepts and half-baked solutions, perhaps on the internet, and such a scenario then becomes ripe for security errors. So these mistakes can be costly in terms of security risks. So I always recommend getting the developer the much needed AppSec training as early as possible in their career, and then revising and retraining based on the latest trends of threat actors exploiting new vulnerabilities. So that's the OAS 10, and that's good for that purpose. But then also based on internal metrics, where you see in your environments developers making similar or or different security vulnerabilities. Perhaps there's deep dive sessions that can be performed in, there as well.
Fascinating. This has been just an amazing conversation. Thanks, Pranshu, for sharing your insights and your expertise. And on behalf of our listeners, I'm grateful to you.
Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, and thank you as well to our listeners for taking the time to listen to this podcast. You can also follow us on Twitter using our handle @SecurityCompass, and you can also follow us on LinkedIn. And with that, I wish you all a safe and a wonderful day. Thank you. The thoughts and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the speaker and do not necessarily reflect those of their organization.